One question I want to
Please.
ask you, Peter Beinart, is Trump was elected a few days ago.
Yes.
He has passed a ton of executive orders. He has given the 2,000-pound bombs to Israel. He has lifted the sanctions on the settlers in the West Bank.
Yes.
And he's now publicly saying that he wants to get all of the Palestinians out of Gaza, push them
Right.
into Jordan or Egypt. What
Right.
do you make of all this?
I think it's horrifying. I mean, Palestinians. What Trump is saying about Gaza, it has a kind of Orwellian quality to it, right? He's saying it's terrible in Gaza. He said the place has been destroyed. So Egypt, or Jordan, you have to open your borders so these people can go to these places. Okay, well, how was it destroyed? Right? It was destroyed with our weaponry that we sent, that he wants to continue to send, right? So rather than destroying the place and saying it's destroyed, you need to go somewhere else, you need to leave the place that you're from, why not destroy it, right? Why not be open to rebuilding it? And beyond that, if you want to really be chutzpahdik about it, if you think that Palestinians shouldn't be in Gaza anymore because Gaza is too shitty, how about they get to go to the places they're from, right? Because most Palestinians in Gaza are not from Gaza, and they're not from Egypt, and they're not from Jordan. They're from what's now Israel. Most Gazans are from families that were expelled from Israel, right? Why should they not have the right to return to the lands from which their parents came?
And I certainly don't mean to steelman Trump's argument, but I wanted to pull out one thing you said, which is,
Sure.
If you don't want to destroy Gaza, then stop destroying it. One thing Trump said is that it already is destroyed.
Right, but why?
Because it's been destroyed through the war, through Israel, through the U.S.,
Yeah.
but that was before Trump got to office.
Okay, right, but he also, as you said, he wants to keep sending those 2,000-pound bombs, right? So we could say we're not going to send you any. We're going to condition our military aid on Israel adhering to, in terms of norms of kind of international legal norms about how you fight, and we're also going to say that that we're going to oppose that we're going to oppose the conditions of oppression that lock Palestinians in Gaza and elsewhere into this condition where they don't have basic rights, right? That's not part of Trump's framework at all. Trump seems to me to be quite comfortable with an act of advocating, actually an act of mass ethnic cleansing.
What do you think his end goal is? Or what do you think will be the end result of all this?
It's hard, it's hard to get in the mind of Donald Trump. I mean, I think there are people in Israel, in the Israeli government, who since the beginning of this, since after October 7th, have wanted basically to depopulate Gaza. So there was reporting in the Washington Post, I think, and elsewhere, that basically Netanyahu was trying to urge the U.S. and British leaders to try to pressure the Egyptians to open the border, right? And so there would be a kind of mass exodus into Egypt. And I think it's very unlikely that Israel would have allowed those people to return, given that Israel has never allowed Palestinian refugees to return, right? So I think this has always been part of it. I mean, from Israel's perspective, from the Israeli government's perspective, like, Palestinians in Gaza are a problem, right? They're a problem because they are fighting against Israel, right? And so how do you solve that problem? Well, one way would be to address their underlying grievances, which is the fact that they lack basic freedoms, right? But that's not really on the table in mainstream Israeli politics, certainly not this Israeli government, right? Another system would be to try to manage this system of oppression in which they don't have basic rights, but you're going to try to manage it with some new kind of government in Gaza. This is kind of what Biden wanted, like put the Palestinian Authority in play. But the Israeli government's not interested in that either, right? So where does that leave you? The Israeli government has said nothing about what kind of political structures they want in Gaza, right? And that's why I think that what people on the Israeli right say very explicitly, like Bezalel Smotrich and Itamar Ben-Gvir, which is essentially that we need to try to depopulate Gaza and also to resettle Israeli settlers there. For them, that's the way of solving the problem. If Palestinians are a problem, then if you have no Palestinians, or at least fewer Palestinians, you have less of a problem.
What do you think is going to happen? Do you have any idea? I mean, is Trump going to kick them all out of Gaza? Is that going to happen?
I mean, I don't know enough about. I know that Egypt has historically been very, very resistant to this because Egypt doesn't want a huge Palestinian refugee population in Egypt. For one thing, because they suspect, probably rightly, that these Palestinian refugees will organize themselves and fight against Israel, right? As Palestinian refugees have been doing since 1948 from Jordan, from Syria, from Lebanon, which are where you have large Palestinian refugee populations. And so then what's going to happen? Israel's was going to go into Egypt to attack them. And Egypt sees that it's going to start getting bombed, right? Like some of other Israel's neighbors. And it's going to destroy the Israeli-Egyptian peace agreement. So I think the Egyptians want none of this. I just don't know if they're strong enough to hold out because Egypt is very deeply in debt, right? They're very economically vulnerable. So I think it's possible that maybe Egypt will, and you'll have hundreds of thousands of people leaving. I also think it's possible that you'll just have a kind of ongoing, Israel will be going in and out of Gaza militarily for years, maybe decades, and the Palestinian population in Gaza will live in these conditions that are really subhuman conditions, right? I mean, I think I read that if you returned to the growth rate that Gaza had before October 7th, it would take something like 80 years to rebuild, to get back to the GDP that it had on October 7th. But it seems to me very little prospect that Israel would allow that. In fact, what Israel seems to be doing is wanting to force people in Gaza into an even smaller amount of territory and actually tighten the blockade.
And let's imagine you're the prime minister of Israel. They get Netanyahu out of there. They said, Peter, you're in. You want these Palestinians to be treated fairly. You know they deserve humanity and dignity. But as the prime minister of Israel, you're also worried about having, separate from the Palestinian population, you're worried about having Hamas terrorists and other terrorists on your border who have committed atrocities like October 7th, whose ideology they've stated explicitly commands them to repeat it over and over and over again. You take them at their word that they do want to continue massacring people in Israel. So how do you contend with that? How do you balance both the need?
I think the problem in the way I would amend what you're saying, I do think it's true that Hamas leaders are saying we will commit further acts of violence, including violence against civilians, including potentially, horrifying acts like October 7th, right? But this is within a particular condition, right? A condition in which Palestinians live under apartheid and blockade, right?
That's what's under debate. So there's half of people are saying that. The other half of people are saying, no, jihadism is an ideology. There is no cause other than itself. It's not about oppression. And the evidence of that, and I'm not even taking a side here, I'm just saying the evidence of that is that you have jihadist groups in other parts of the world who do terrorist activity who are not oppressed by a government. 9/11 being an example, right? Like there was no cause and effect there. It was just jihadism.
No, I mean, I think it's important to make a very clear distinction between a justification and an explanation, right? An explanation is trying to understand why something happens. A justification is saying something is okay, right? So October 7th, there is no justifying October 7th. There was no justifying 9/11. But 9/11 had explanations, right? For instance, Al Qaeda was enraged that U.S. troops were on Saudi soil, right? So there was a cause for that.
Should we placate terror? Should we say, well, if we upset this group of people, they might terror? Like we can't. No society is going to live in accordance with. How do we prevent? Well, how do we not anger terrorists? Like that's how societies are going to.
If you want your people to be safe, right, it's not a good idea in my view, to inflict tremendous violence on people who live right next door to them, who are their neighbors, right? Because that system of violence, and when you deny people basic rights, you are inflicting a huge amount of violence on them. That violence ultimately makes things less safe for everybody. There was if conditions where states where everyone has a voice in government tend to be more peaceful because people have the ability then to get the government to respond to them without having to take up arms. That's part of the reason that I think apartheid South Africa became safer when apartheid ended. It's part of the reason the United States is much safer than it would be if black people hadn't gotten the vote in 1965. I think Hamas's ideology of Islamism is fundamentally antithetical to my beliefs because it violates the principle of equality under the law. I don't believe in Islamic supremacy. I don't believe in Islamic states. I believe in states that treat everybody equally. The problem with thinking that Israel's fundamental problem was with Hamas is that Palestinians have been resisting and fighting against Israel since long before Hamas existed. Hamas was only created in 1987. If you think about the Palestinian armed resistance of the 1970s, some of it quite terrible, right? The Munich massacre at the Olympics in 1972, the Ma'alot massacre in northern Israel, the airplane hijackings. None of those people were Islamists. They were either, many of them were from leftist groups like the PFLP, kind of Marxist groups.
But I feel like you're making my point stronger by saying, look.
No, I'm saying that that Islamism is not the reason Palestinians resist, because Palestinians have been fighting against Israel in violent and non-violent ways.
And some Israelis would say it's anti-Semitism. They would say, why would you commit the Munich?
That's a different argument. I mean, or we can also point to Islamist groups that don't fight against Israel, right? I mentioned earlier Mansour Abbas and his Ram party, right, which joined Naftali Bennett's government. That's an Islamist party. Mansour Abbas is an Islamist.
Whether it's Islamist,
my point is that you can't explain Palestinian responses to Israel as a function of Islamism.
But you could explain it as but some of it, but to say, oh well, this terrorist wasn't a jihadist. What's your point? I mean, my
point is that if Hamas ceased to exist and there were no more Palestinian Islamists and all the Palestinians were communists or secular nationalists, under conditions of oppression, you're still going to have Palestinians fighting against Israel, and indeed probably still fighting against Israel in ways that take Israeli lives, including civilian lives. If you want to try to make sure that isn't the case, I think you have to do two things. First of all, you have to you have to support Palestinian resistance, which is ethical, which doesn't take civilian life. If you shut down nonviolent mechanisms in which people struggle for freedom, you are making it more likely that you're going to have armed, unethical resistance against civilians. And if you give people basic rights, so they have a voice in government where they don't need to pick up a gun, then you're going to have much less violence. Why are Palestinian citizens less likely to take up armed resistance than Palestinian non-citizens in the West Bank and Gaza? I think it's partly because they have citizenship.
But here's where it breaks down for me a little bit. You're saying what seems obvious, which is if you oppress a group of people, they're going to fight back. Okay.
Yes.
But the other side of the argument would be, but there's some element of Hamas or Palestinians or whomever that think they deserve the entirety of Israel. And they have attacked Israel not just because of oppression. So an example of that is Israel's Gaza disengagement in 2005. Mm-hmm. Israel unilaterally, I can't pronounce words. Unilaterally, is that the word? Withdrew all settlers and military forces from Gaza, ending direct occupation of the territory. Despite that, rocket attacks from Gaza increased.
Right, but that's not true.
Right. Which part's not true?
Israel did withdraw all its settlements, right? But it still maintained military control over Gaza, right? So after the disengagement in 2005, for instance, Israel maintained a military buffer inside the Gaza Strip from which Palestinians were barred, where basically if you went up too near the fence, then basically you could be shot at. Israel maintained control over Gaza's coastline, over its airspace, over its population registry. You needed to be an Israeli computer system to come in and out of Gaza, and Israel controlled most of the land crossing. So essentially, the best way I think to think about what happens in Gaza after 2005 is that prison guards could leave the interior of a prison, but if they are still surrounding the prison on the perimeter, controlling all people and goods that come in and out, it's still a prison. It's not a territory that is free.
Well, they got rid of their military. 8,000 settlers from Gaza, 21 settlements, withdrew all military forces. They no longer govern Gaza.
But they still maintained control over Gaza. I mean, if you can't come in and out of Gaza, right, without Israeli permission, right? If Israel's controlling the airspace and the coastline and most of the land borders and the very population registry itself, Israel's still maintaining control, just in a different way.
Got it. So you're saying it's whenever Palestinians attack Israel, it's always in response to Israeli aggression.
I don't think that. Look, again, when you say it that way, I don't justify Palestinian attacks against Israeli civilians, not at all. But you can't understand. I mean, anyone who talks to Palestinians about understanding why Palestinians attack Israelis are going to talk about the conditions of oppression that Palestinians face. Right? It's not incidental.
It's not incidental, but there has to be some agency or onus responsibility on both sides. And like my point about disengagement in 2005, and you're saying, well, they were still there. Yeah, but my point is that in 2005, they disengaged, whether it was 20% or 90% or somewhere in between. if the smart thing for Palestinians to have done at that point was not to continue launching rockets into
let's
Israel.
imagine that Palestinians elect a government that is fundamentally opposed to armed resistance against Israel, that forswears violence, and not only forswears violence, but says we want to work closely with the Israeli military to make sure that no other Palestinian groups commit acts of violence against Israel, right? We actually have seen that movie, right? Since the end of the Second Intifada, under Mahmoud Abbas, the Palestinian Authority has worked very closely with the Israeli military to limit armed resistance in the West Bank. And under Salam Fayyad, right, who was the prime minister from 2007 to 2013, who was actually quite beloved among Israeli leaders and among the United States, because he worked so closely with Israel. And Salam Fayyad's position was, if we do everything possible to reassure Israel and to help make sure that Israelis stay safe, then surely we will get something from Israel in return. Israel didn't stop settlement growth for a single day. And when Salam Fayyad left politics, he said, I have been defeated. Israel never supported me. And in fact, they discredited me. And he said Hamas would grow stronger, which is exact. So that's why most Palestinians, in my experience, they don't believe that if they did the things that you are suggesting they do, that they would actually improve their circumstances.
Well, because attacking is not improving it. I mean, right? I guess I just want to walk through a couple examples. Maybe you can help me understand these in context that you have. So just really quickly, final point of 2005. So Israel did unilaterally withdraw. Yeah, they still had a presence there, but the action that took place in 2005 was a withdrawal of
they just changed the form of their control.
That was it? Okay. Yeah, so how about in the 1990s? So
the military, the civilian settler population, they did withdraw, but the military element, they changed the way in which they controlled Gaza militarily.
Okay, so how about in the Oslo Accord? So despite Israel making lots of concessions to the Palestinians,
what concessions?
Well, one example was a partial self-rule through the Palestinian Authority. Despite that, terrorist groups, Hamas, Islamic Jihad, launched suicide bombings and other attacks. An example was 96, the Jerusalem bus bombing. That happened during an active peace process.
Yes, that's true, and it's true that Hamas committed suicide bombings and other terrorist attacks during the Oslo.
Right. Process. So you're Israel, and you see, okay, 96, and this year these things happen. So you become a defensive state because you're saying
right. I actually write quite a bit about the Oslo process in the book. It's important to understand what Oslo was, what the terms of Oslo were, right? The deal in Oslo was that the PLO recognized Israel, right, and forswore armed resistance, right, and Israel recognized the PLO as a legitimate negotiating partner that represented the Palestinian people. The Oslo never promised Palestinians a state, nor did it promise an end to settlement growth, right? In fact, Yitzhak Rabin had never come out in support of a Palestinian state on the day he was assassinated, right? So what happens over the course of Oslo, right, is that Hamas from the very beginning is saying, we're suckers. This deal is a lousy deal for us. In fact, not only Hamas, Edward Said, famously, the great Palestinian intellectual, called Oslo a Palestinian Versailles, because he said, look at the imbalance here. We have recognized Israel, but they have not promised us a state. They've not even stopped the settlement growth that is moving us further and further away from a state. So as settlement growth continues over the course of the 1990s, Palestinians become less and less supportive of Oslo because they feel like instead of it moving towards a state, it's moving them away from a state. And it's under those conditions that you have more Palestinian acts of violence. I think those Palestinian acts of violence were wrong, right? One of them actually took the life of a college friend of mine, right? They were fundamentally wrong. But if you want to understand why Oslo breaks down, you have to understand the conditions that were taking place.
And I guess if you're Israel, you're not acting like your compass is not, okay, what is the morally right thing to do? Your priority as Israel, as the prime minister, is to survive. So when there's this,
survive,
it's to survive. It's to not get overrun.
You as an individual, or who's country?
I'm saying if you're the prime minister of Israel,
you mean the people?
If you're the government of Israel, the goal is for survival. It's not
the survival of who?
Of the people of Israel, the state of Israel.
Wait, but you mean survival of all the people under the control of the state of Israel, or some of the people?
All of them.
People are under Israeli control are Palestinian. Are you acting in a way for the people, those for them to survive?
the government of Israel does protect the Palestinian civilians. And now we're talking about
The
the
Palestinian civilians in Gaza? It doesn't seem to me to
I guess
that.
my final point on this was that my guess is that the goal of Israel is to survive, and if these terrorist attacks happen, regardless if Israel played a role in it, they're not thinking like the most important thing to them is not morality, it's survival. And if you have terrorists beneath you who do these things and you can explain them, Israel's just thinking we need to make these stop.
Right. Yes, I think that's exactly right. I think you're right, and that's why Israel responds militarily, right? And it doesn't work, right? And same reason it didn't work when the British were responding to the IRA military attacks, some of which were really awful, bombing drug department stores in London, as a military problem, because they weren't until they dealt with the underlying grievances of Catholics in Northern Ireland who weren't being treated equally. It's also the reason that the ANC, you couldn't defeat the ANC as a military problem. When people lack basic human rights, they're going to resist that oppression. You can bomb them, you can shoot them, you can imprison them, but they're going to still keep fighting you. I think the wiser way to try to to create safety for everyone is to respond to the underlying grievances that people have when they don't have human freedom.